When we hear the word myth, we often think of fantasy, stories invented to entertain. But in early societies, myths served a very different purpose. They were records of survival. In ancient Vietnam, one of the most enduring legends is the story of Tinh and Thủy, the mountain god and the water god. On the surface, it is a tale of rivalry and divine conflict. Beneath that surface, however, lies a sophisticated memory of floods, landscape adaptation, and early state formation. This is not just a myth, it is a historical worldview preserved through storytelling. In the collective memory of the Vietnamese people, the legend of Tinh and Thủy does not exist as an isolated tale. It is the crystallization of thousands of years of living alongside water, along rivers, floods, and the persistent anxiety of an agrarian community formed on the margins of great river systems. To understand this legend, it cannot be approached as a purely divine or mythological story. It must be placed back into the historical and environmental context in which it emerged. During the formative period of the Von Long state, the living space of ancient Vietnamese communities was concentrated primarily in what is now northern Vietnam, a region with exceptionally complex geography. This area lies at the intersection of uplands, lowlands, and a dense river network, with the Red River serving as a vital axis of life. However, in prehistoric and proto-historic times, the Red River Delta was far from stable. It was a dynamic landscape, constantly reshaped by sedimentation, sea level fluctuations, monsoon rainfall, and large-scale cyclical floods. Geological and paleoclimatic research indicates that between approximately 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, sea levels were higher than they are today. River channels frequently shifted, and flooding was not an exceptional event, but a regular feature of life. Under such conditions, humans could not defeat nature. Survival depended instead on learning to read environmental patterns, remembering their rhythms, and transmitting that knowledge across generations. It was within this context that the legend of Tinh and Thủy took shape. According to the story, during the era of the Hung kings, there lived a princess named Minung, whose beauty was said to be so extraordinary that her fame reached not only the human world, but also the realm of the gods. Two powerful deities came to seek her hand: Tinh, lord of the mountains, and Thủy, lord of water, rain, rivers, and the sea. The Hung king did not choose based on emotion or favoritism. Instead, he established a rule: whoever brought the required offerings first would marry the princess. Significantly, the offerings were not gold or material wealth. They were highly symbolic objects: elephants with 9 tusks, roosters with 9 spurs, and horses with 9 red manes. In ancient Vietnamese thought, the number 9 was associated with completeness, authority, and the sacred. These offerings were not measures of material value, but indicators of the ability to command nature and mobilize resources. The Hung king did not align himself with either force, nor did he intervene directly in the conflict. He acted instead as the lawgiver. This reflects an early conception of order and authority. Conflict must be regulated by rules, not resolved solely through raw power. Tinh arrived first, married Minung, and brought her to the highlands. Thủy arrived later, enraged and unleashed floods against Tinh. As the waters rose, Tinh raised the land higher. The struggle continued until Thủy was exhausted and withdrew. Yet the story does not end there. Every year, Thủy returns, bringing floods once more, and every year Tinh resists. When viewed through the lens of archaeology, the legend reveals additional layers of meaning. Archaeological sites associated with the Feng Wen, Dong Dao, Go Mun, and Dong Son cultures show a consistent pattern. Ancient Vietnamese communities did not settle randomly. They favored relatively elevated ground, riverine mounds, ancient alluvial terraces, and low foothills. This was not an aesthetic choice, but a strategy for survival. Many sites display evidence of interrupted occupation, with cultural layers buried by sediment and later reoccupied. This suggests repeated episodes in which floods forced communities to abandon settlements, followed by returns when conditions stabilized. In collective memory, these experiences were not recorded in writing, but encoded in mythic imagery: rising waters, elevated land, in an endless confrontation. In the symbolic language of ancient Vietnam, mountains are not merely mountains, and water is not merely water. Mountains represent stability, safety, and sustainable living space. Water represents uncertainty, danger, and a force that can never be fully controlled. Son Tinh and Thủy Tinh are therefore not opposing individuals, but two coexisting principles within agrarian life. One especially significant detail is that Thủy Tinh is never destroyed. In many other cultural traditions, chaotic forces are defeated permanently to establish an eternal order. In the Vietnamese legend, order is never absolute. Thủy Tinh retreats, but always returns. This reflects a worldview that does not assume total domination over nature. Floods are understood as a rule, not an anomaly. This is a remarkably sophisticated form of environmental memory. The legend does not seek to explain why floods occur. Instead, it accepts their inevitability and focuses attention on human response. The core of the story lies not in the flood itself, but in how people adapt to it, raising land, choosing higher ground, and constructing living spaces resilient to water. Looked at more closely, Son Tinh does not act alone. Raising land is not an individual act, it is the product of collective labor, earthworks, elevated platforms, settlement planning. Beneath the mythological surface, we glimpse communities capable of coordination and shared effort in the face of environmental threat. This is the seed of a more complex social organization, moving beyond isolated tribal structures. Mi Nuong, in this context, is more than a beautiful princess. In ancient thought, royal women often symbolized land, population centers, and fertility. Son Ting's marriage to Mi Nuong can be understood as the community's choice of elevated land as the core of survival, rather than continued dependence on vulnerable lowlands. Son Tinh and Thủy Tinh emerges not as a random tale, but as a cognitive map of the living environment. It marks safe spaces and dangerous ones. It teaches that floods will return, and preparedness is essential. It does not promote the destruction of nature, but resilience and endurance. At its deepest level, the legend reflects a society that had moved beyond total dependence on nature, yet had not reached the illusion of total control. This intermediate state is characteristic of the Van Long era, a society with enough experience to adapt, enough organization to respond collectively, and enough humility to remain in awe of forces greater than itself. It was within this balance between agency and vulnerability that the legend was born, as a means to remember, to teach, and to remind future generations that survival does not come from conquest, but from the ability to stand firm through each season of rising waters.
The legend of Son Tinh and Thủy Tinh reveals how ancient Vietnamese communities preserved environmental memory and an understanding of flood cycles. At a deeper level, however, the story reflects a far more significant transformation: the emergence of political thinking and social organization that extended beyond the scale of isolated villages. This is precisely where the legend begins to intersect with the early political history of the Vang Lang state. In wet rice agricultural societies, water is not merely a natural element, it is the decisive condition for survival. Rice fields depend on water, yet water can also destroy them. For this reason, power in such societies did not originate primarily from military conquest or force, but from the ability to manage and regulate water. Whoever could organize communities to withstand floods effectively controlled the survival of the entire inhabited region. Seen through this lens, Son Tinh, stripped of his divine attributes, embodies the concentration of this capability. The act of raising mountains is not a miracle, but a symbolic representation of collective engineering works, elevating house foundations, raising farmland, creating residential mounds, and controlling water flow at a communal scale. These tasks require coordination, division of labor, and above all, a shared decision-making mechanism. No single family or lineage could accomplish them independently. At this point, the legend reveals a crucial detail. Son Ting does not fight with weapons. He does not destroy Thủy Ting, nor does he pursue his opponent. Instead, he reshapes living space. This reflects a form of power fundamentally different from later militarized state models. It is power rooted in organizational capacity rather than direct violence. Within this context, the role of the Hung King becomes particularly significant. In the legend of Son Ting and Thủy Ting, the Hung King is neither a warrior nor an omnipotent deity. He appears as an arbiter, one who establishes rules and recognizes outcomes. This suggests that political thinking in Vang Lang's society had already surpassed the level of tribal leadership, where authority is typically tied to personal strength or direct lineage. The Hung King represents a more abstract form of power, the power to establish norms. By setting the conditions for the bride price and the moment that determines victory, royal authority is expressed through the creation of an order accepted by all parties. In a society without writing, laws were transmitted through storytelling, and authority was legitimized through narrative. A detail often overlooked, yet critically important, is that the Hung King does not intervene after his decision is made. When Thủy Ting unleashes floods, the king neither commands suppression nor supports Son Ting through force. This reflects a pragmatic recognition that certain conflicts lie beyond the reach of central authority. The early state does not control nature, it can only create conditions that allow communities to adapt to it. From this perspective, the legend of Son Ting and Thủy Ting does not glorify absolute power, but rather celebrates balance. The Vang Lang state, as reflected in the legend, appears as a flexible and adaptive structure, one that coordinates rather than imposes. This characteristic aligns closely with the environmental conditions of Southeast Asia, where nature is highly dynamic and resists rigid control. Mi Nuong continues to serve as a central symbol. She scarcely appears in the narrative after the marriage, but this absence is meaningful. Once the center of settlement has been established in the highlands, the individual figure becomes less important than the stability of living space. Mi Nuong thus represents land that has been fixed and a population that has been reorganized. Son Ting's act of bringing Mi Nuong to the mountains can also be understood as a strategic relocation of the community, from vulnerable lowlands to safer terrain. This does not imply abandoning the plains altogether, but rather a spatial restructuring, high ground for stable residence combined with lowlands for controlled production. This model remains clearly visible in the structure of northern Vietnamese villages many centuries later. At an even deeper level, the endless confrontation between Son Ting and Thủy Ting reflects a political reality. The authority of an early state is periodically tested. Each flood season serves as a trial of social organization. Failure would not only result in crop loss, but potentially in the disintegration of social structure itself. Recounting this story year after year therefore functions as a collective reminder of the responsibility to maintain shared order. Notably, the legend does not conclude with permanent victory. There is no promise of a future without floods. Instead, there is a cycle. Water rises, land is elevated, water recedes, and life continues. This reflects a remarkably mature political mindset, one that acknowledges the limits of human power while affirming the irreplaceable role of social organization. When compared with many other ancient civilizations, where rulers are often depicted as conquerors of nature or recipients of absolute divine authority, the figure of the Hung King in this legend appears strikingly modest. Power does not stem from overpowering nature, but from sustaining communal stability amid unavoidable change.
At this point, the legend transcends the boundaries of folklore. It becomes an implicit manifesto for how ancient Vietnamese society understood organization. Not extreme, not absolute, not obsessed with total control, but centered on adaptation, endurance, and the capacity to rebuild after each crisis. Viewed through this lens, the legend of Son Ting and Thủy Ting reveals that the Vang Wang state, though still in its formative stage, already embodied a clear philosophy of existence. It was the philosophy of a community that understood it lived in a harsh environment, and that true strength lay not in defeating nature, but in organizing people to stand together against it. For this reason, the story is never told as something finished. It is retold every year, just as floods return every year, not to instill fear, but to remind that social order, like land itself, must be continually built up, elevated, and protected, not once, but forever.
When the legend of Son Ting and Thủy Ting is placed within the broader panorama of human history, one thing becomes immediately clear. The ancient Vietnamese were not alone in transforming memories of natural disasters into mythology. Nearly every major civilization possesses a flood narrative. Yet what distinguishes the Vietnamese legend is not the presence of flooding itself, but the way human beings are positioned at the center of the story. Son Ting Thủy Ting does not tell a story of divine punishment, nor does it celebrate a final, absolute victory. There is no moment in which the old world is erased, nor any promise that nature will be permanently subdued. Instead, the legend presents a recurring condition where conflict is normalized and survival is measured by the ability to endure successive cycles of crisis. This difference reflects with remarkable clarity the geographical and social realities of Van Long society. The Red River Delta is not a space that can be controlled once and then stabilized forever. It is a dynamic ecosystem in which water, land, and human communities are constantly negotiating with one another. In such an environment, extreme political thinking, whether total domination or complete surrender to nature, is impractical. What emerges instead is a flexible, moderate philosophy that accepts limits and prioritizes resilience. This helps explain why no character in the legend is portrayed as wholly good or wholly evil. Thủy Ting causes floods, but not out of malice. He represents a natural force that cannot be eliminated. Son Ting resists the floods, but not in order to conquer nature. His purpose is to preserve human living space. Even the Hung King is not depicted as an all-powerful sovereign, but as a symbolic anchor of shared order. From this perspective, the legend of Son Ting Thủy Ting can be understood as a kind of spiritual constitution of ancient Vietnamese society. It does not prescribe detailed laws, but it establishes foundational principles. Nature is an unavoidable partner in human existence. Power exists to coordinate rather than to impose, and communities can survive only through sustained cooperation over time. Because it embodies these principles, the legend has never been frozen in the past. It continues to live within the cultural structures of Vietnamese society across centuries. Systems of dikes, village organization, communal solidarity during flood seasons, and even the collective mindset of preparing for next year all carry the imprint of Son Ting Thủy Ting thinking. This is a mindset that does not seek absolute certainty, but continuous adaptability. Viewed from the present, in the context of global climate change, the legend becomes more relevant than ever. Modern civilization, armed with technology and science, once believed that humanity could fully control nature, yet extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and increasingly frequent floods are forcing the world to reconsider that assumption. In this regard, the worldview of ancient Vietnamese society appears strikingly prescient. It never believed in total control. Son Ting does not build an eternal wall to block the water. He raises the land each time the water rises. This is a flexible way of thinking, one that accepts change and remains ready to adjust.
In contemporary terms, it is an approach centered on climate adaptation rather than absolute resistance. At its deepest level, the legend of Son Ting Tui Ting demonstrates that history is not preserved only through written records or political chronicles. History also survives as stories, collective memory, and symbolic imagery. In societies where writing was not yet widespread, myth served as a repository of social knowledge. It taught people to live, how to organize, and how to understand the world around them. For this reason, when we listen to or read this legend today, the essential task is not to believe in the literal existence of gods, but to grasp the message transmitted by earlier generations. It is a message about humility before nature, about the value of community, and about a form of power that is quiet yet enduring, the power of social organization and collective intelligence. Son Ting is not the ultimate victor. Tui Ting is not a permanently defeated enemy. Both continue to exist, like mountains and water, like stability and change, and humanity, standing between these forces, learns how to live, how to build, and how to pass experience on to future generations. Perhaps this is why the legend of Son Ting Tui Ting has never lost its significance. It does not speak of a time that is ended, but of a condition that persists. It does not promise that humanity will conquer nature. It suggests that humanity can endure if it learns to organize, to adapt, and to accept its own limitations. And this may be the most enduring lesson that ancient Vietnamese history offers to the modern world. In a world defined by constant change, true strength lies not in controlling everything, but in standing together, season after season, flood after flood.